One of the emerging issues in community managed microfinance is an industry belief that these institutions cannot possibly be adequate to meet the challenge of capitalizing development enterprise, and they may be right. They are institutions that meet a profoundly felt need for financial services that help people to manage their livelihoods without necessarily being instruments that require people to become entrepreneurs or to invest in business. You'll find that many of these institutions in urban and peri-urban areas, in fact, do suffer from a capital deficit and could do with an external injection of funds. But the vast majority in rural areas do not. And there is strong evidence to suggest that the effort to link these institutions to external sources of finance is difficult. It's difficult from the point of view of, first of all, determining whether or not there is a need for it, whether in fact there is a capital deficit. There is an important need to stress the savings mobilization component of community managed microfinance, and if linkage is to be forged, to start with linkages which are based upon savings rather than upon capitalization coming externally. But it does need to be handled very carefully. It is an emerging trend within the industry, but in terms of my own personal beliefs, I feel that this is a solution in search of a problem, that until I see hundreds of thousands of these community managed microfinance institutions covering the landscape, beginning to make their own case for additional interventions that will allow them to offer more flexible and better adapted services to their members, my preference would be to watch and wait rather than to presume that the solution is yet again a credit-led relationship, which evidence has shown in some countries can be very destabilizing and very hard to engineer. The bulk of programs that are doing community managed microfinance are based in Africa because this is where it started. And the organizations that have picked up on it are mostly large-scale international NGOs that are looking for a methodology that allows them to deliver financial services to poor people, which does not require a high degree of staff specialization and which doesn't require massive investment in the development of some form of institutional provision to provide these kinds of services. So that's how it all started. But there's plenty of evidence that when it's tried in other parts of the world, it works pretty well. For example, in Colombia right now, there is a community managed microfinance program. The CLP program, Child's Livelihood program in Bangladesh, has now got somewhat in the region of 50,000 people doing community managed microfinance in northwest Bangladesh. It's working in Indonesia. It's being implemented in Vietnam. It's also working in Ecuador and Peru. These are all relatively small programs that have come on in the last 4 or 5 years. But there is, as yet, no significant evidence that the methodology doesn't work when you're in those kinds of environments, particularly in rural areas. There's a lot of excitement about community managed microfinance, and it's really rather strange. We have an animal that has finally, to some degree, provided a partial solution for the provision of financial services to places where it's never been possible before. It's moving to scale. Programs have moved away from area-focused programs to programs with a national focus. There's a trend towards moving to very, very significant scale in terms of the numbers of groups. So all of this, I think, is very positive, and it's natural and correct. The risks that face us as we move forward, I think, are that we, first of all, we impose our own ambitions for creating inclusive financial systems onto an instrument that may not be designed to bear the load. That once we start moving these institutions to significant scale, once we move beyond 30 or 40 people in a group, once we begin to inject significant amounts of external capital, once we begin to see them as vehicles for a wide variety of development interventions, we increase the cost of the intervention, we increase the demand upon the people who are managing them, both in terms of time and skill. We may even divert them away from their original purpose, and we risk imposing our own sense of where they ought to be headed upon them. I feel that this is probably the danger that we face right now, because as it becomes a more popular movement, a lot of very clever and ambitious people are moving into the field and are seeing the future very much in terms of what community managed microfinance cannot do, rather than simply seeking to consolidate what it can do, recognizing its limitations and seeking discrete and opportunistic interventions rather than broad brush interventions which suggest that this is the right way to go, rather than, being satisfied to allow the direction of this movement to define itself. Another mistake that I think that really needs to be avoided is to confuse the simplicity of the methodology with simplicity in terms of how these programs are implemented. The evidence is clear that when they're implemented by dedicated field staff who are well supervised, you get a good result. And that requires sound, fairly standard management practice. But the tendency is to think that because the instrument itself is simple, because the sort of way in which training is delivered is also very simple, then somehow or another management attention can also be somewhat neglected, if you will. And I think that this is an important point to emphasize, that if you are going to do community managed microfinance, it does need to be within the disciplined framework of management.